So now, our next contradiction, and this is one that is actually found in all four of the Gospels. And so sometimes when you see some of these things, sometimes people will look at it and they'll say, oh, wow, they've got their things mixed up. So when Jesus died on the cross, and remember, there was an inscription put over whenever someone was crucified, they would basically have a board over the top of their head, and it would basically list what were the crimes. Like you had the two thieves on the cross, one on the right, one on the left. One would probably be saying, okay, this guy was accused of stealing something. Or this guy was accused of this or this or this and this and this. And this is why he was being crucified. So you had to know exactly what it was. And remember when Jesus was put on the cross? They put an inscription over top of him. And a lot of times what you'll see is whenever you see it, you generally will have the words INRI on there. And so what I want to show you is that each of the four Gospels interprets that differently. And so some people say, oh, okay, well, you got a contradiction in the Bible, because why wouldn't they get something like that right? Why four different things that were there? And so if you start out, let's go to Matthew. Chapter 27. In verse number 37.
Set up over his head his accusation written, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews."
Okay, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Now that's what Matthew says. Now go to Mark chapter 15 and verse number 26.
The superscription of his accusation was written over the King of Jews.
Okay, Matthew says this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Okay, Mark just writes the King of the Jews. Okay, now let's go to Luke chapter 23 and verse number 38.
The superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews.
All right, this is the King of the Jews. Now go to John 19:19. So we got, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews, the King of the Jews, this is the King of the Jews. So now we've got three. So let's just go ahead and get number 4. You got it?
Claudia had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross that read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.
Yeah, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So when you look at this, you think, okay, so I've got 4 different writers, and all 4 of them have got something different. Why would it be different? Why wouldn't they be the same?
Everybody interprets it different?
Huh?
Everybody interprets it.
It was kind of because it was interpreted different. But look at John 19:20. And what's it say about it?
It was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek.
Yeah, so it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. So what you actually see is you actually have over Jesus, there were a lot of people there in Jerusalem, okay, coming for the Passover. Well, you have to understand that not everybody there spoke Hebrew. They weren't just all Jewish. Okay? So, when you're Roman, the Romans spoke Latin. The Gentiles, they spoke Greek. The Jews spoke Hebrew. So when they were crucifying these guys, it wasn't just one language. It was so that whoever came by there, if you were Jewish, it was written for you in Hebrew. If you were Roman, it was written in Latin. If you were a Gentile, then it was written in Greek. So you have
Three different.
on the one big huge thing. What they did is they had it written in 3 different languages. It's like today, okay? When you buy something, when you buy something, a lot of times what you'll see is it may be English, Spanish, and French. And so depending upon which language that you speak, you would understand it in that language. So when the writers were doing this, you have to understand sometimes who the writers were writing to.
Did they do all of them that way or just Jesus?
I would assume every one of them, okay? Not just Jesus. Because again, it's Jerusalem, which is kind of the hub of Israel. And in there, you had a lot of the Roman government, which wanted to make sure that they kept the Jewish people in control. So you would have a lot of Roman soldiers and probably a lot of their people in Jerusalem controlling some of the stuff. You would have the Jewish people, which were there, and then you would also have a lot of the Gentiles, okay, especially Samaritans and all of these that basically would coming into there. So you would have the Gentiles, you would have the Romans, and you would have the Jewish people. So they would be looking at it at 3 different ways. So when you look at Matthew, when Matthew was looking at his inscription, you begin to understand that Matthew, when Matthew was basically writing the book of Matthew, it was written basically to the Jewish people. So when Matthew was writing a lot of the stuff that you would read in the book of Matthew, he's writing it from the perspective that you know something about the Jewish culture. And so sometimes that's where it becomes very difficult for us to interpret it, because we don't know a lot about the Jewish customs or cultures unless you go back and study it. Okay, they'll mention a lot of the feast. They'll mention the feast of the unleavened bread. They'll mention the Passover. They'll mention Pentecost. Okay, all of these were Jewish feasts. And so when Matthew is talking about this, and as a matter of fact, do you know how they basically interpreted or came across that Jesus' ministry was like 3 1/3 years? They based it upon like the number of feasts, like the Passover. The Passover was once a year. And so what they did was, through the writings that were there, they're saying, okay, he attended 1 Passover, 2 Passovers, 3 Passovers. So we know it's at least 3 years. And then they would calculate the months, and that's when they came up and they said, basically, it was 3 years and about 3 months that his ministry was, based upon things that were going on and things that were happening. And that's how they calculated, his life. Now, the other aspect of it, when he was born, Jesus was not really born on 0 AD, okay? Even though we do that, what they did was they went back and readjusted the calendar, because the Jewish calendar was based upon 12 months out of the year and 30 days each month. So the Jewish calendar had 360 days in it. They didn't do anything about the revolution of the sun and the earth, or the earth around the sun. Okay? They didn't know this until later. And once they found out about this, that's when they went back and adjusted the calendars back. And actually what ended up happening was, based upon the time frame of earth and man being on the earth, five days a year added to that calendar, that's how they came up with 4 years, basically stating that Jesus was probably born around 4 BC. Okay? And so that's why you'll hear a lot of times, I'll tell you that Jesus was born at 4 BC, and it's based upon those calculations that are there. So Matthew writes to us, he writes to us from a Jewish perspective. So what does he do? He gives us the Hebrew interpretation, which says, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Now, when you come to Mark, okay, Mark's audience was written more to the Latin or the Romans. And so what does he give you? The King of the Jews. He's just straightforward with it. This is what it is. Here's this crime. And then when you come to Luke, remember Luke basically wrote his message to the Gentiles. And what Luke would do is Luke would have then wrote, or when he begins to start reading here, he gives us, the way that this thing was going and everything. So what he did was he quoted the Greek. And the Greek said, this is the King of the Jews. So now you say, okay, so what does John do? Well, you got to understand. What John does is he just kind of breaks it down into a small little package that basically says, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And so he kind of puts it all together. And so when you begin to look at all of this and see, it really isn't a contradiction. It depends upon which inscription that they're looking at and they're interpreting. And this is the problem that most of them, don't even get. So when you look at these inscriptions or these interpretations of the scripture, when we bring it into English, out of all 4 of them, there is one thing that they all had in common. And that was the King of the Jews. And why was that? Because that you'll find in Luke chapter 23 and verse number 2. Okay? Somebody got it? Want to go for it?
And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king."
Yeah. So, what was the only crime that they had? Remember, they started out by bringing Jesus into court in the middle of the night. And they were taking him from one place to the other. And remember what happened? They started bringing these people as witnesses against him. And remember what happened? In order for you to be accused of a crime, you had to have 2 witnesses of the crime. And the problem was they were all coming in and they were throwing all kinds of stuff at him. And none of it was sticking. The only thing that they could find was, what did Jesus say? Or they said, "Aren't you the Messiah, the King of the Jews?" And he says, "You say so." You said so. That was the only crime that they could get him on. Saying, oh, he says he's the king of the Jews. And if you remember, the Jewish people said, no, he is not our king. But because he's a poor guy. He comes from a poor family. There's no royalty. Failing to realize he had more royalty than anybody. And his bloodline ran back to God and also back to David. So he had more royalty and was rightfully the heir to the throne of David, more than anybody else alive during that period of time, or ever was in that period of time. Because when you look at it, he had a heavenly father coming from the lineage of David because he created it. You had an earthly father who was coming from the lineage of David because his ancestry was there. And then you had your mother who was also from the lineage of David because she was also in the same line. And they just crossed paths. And so when you say, okay, well, that's his crime, that's the only thing that they could find. So when you look at all four of the writers, okay, they may have a different way in putting some of it there together, but what you will find out is they all have one phrase in common: King of the Jews. And so there's no contradiction here. This is where people start splitting hairs, and they'll do this to you and they'll find other scriptures that you'll also find that maybe one writer will have it this way and another writer has it this way, and they'll say, oh, there's a contradiction. No, you got to understand how they were writing. Who was their audience? Okay, it's not a contradiction. It's God is making His word accessible to all of us, and all of us means we're coming from different backgrounds. It may be expressed differently, or we may interpret it differently, but it all comes up with the same message, no matter what nationality you are, or dialect, or any. And it wasn't just in their time, it's in our time too. It doesn't matter what language that we speak. And when we interpret it, and this is where you find out if a translation is true, okay? Because like the Bible, we all have English versions of the Bible, but they're a different translation of that, okay? You have the King James, you have the New King James, you have the American Standard, you have the New American Standard Bible, you have the Authorized Standard Version, you have the Revised Standard Version, you have the New Living Translation, you have the English Standard Version, you have the Holman Christian Standard Bible, you have the Message, which used to be called Good News for Modern Man. Okay, now they repackaged it because nobody was buying the Good News for Modern Man, so they repackaged it and they call it the Message today. Okay, and it's a paraphrase. You have another one which is called Phillips Amplified Bible, which is a paraphrase. Okay, it doesn't say that it's a translation word for word. I'm giving you an idea. What was the main idea behind all of these words? So when you see this happening, they aren't contradictions. Okay? It's how you're translating it into what language and who they were talking to. And that's the great thing about the Bible that God has. So now, in all of this, let's go, if you would, to Luke chapter 3 and verse number 36. Now, in Luke chapter 3, what you have is the genealogy of Christ, okay?
I'm trying not.
Huh?
I'm trying not.
When you look at, okay, when you look at this, what happens here, okay, is if you actually go down to verse number 38. Now, here's the fascinating thing about this. When you do your genealogy, you generally start with you, right? And you work your way backwards until you get back to God. And then when you get back, actually when you get back to Adam, then you stop your genealogy, and Adam is the son of God. So you know that you've traced it all the way back to there, right? Good luck trying to do that. Okay? We have I don't know about you, but I was doing a genealogy for my mom and my dad, and trying to trace their roots. And I tell you what, you get into Kentucky in the 1800s.
Yeah, I found that out.
It's a mess. I was talking to my mom one day, and I was kind of ribbing her because back in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, when they would do a census, okay, the way they would do it is they would come to your house. Okay, they would come to your house and they would say, okay, how many people are in this household? Okay, and so you would have all of these people that were in this household, right? And they would say, okay, who's the head of the household? And you would have the head of the household basically being the man. Okay, who's his wife? There. And then you would have all of these others. Then there would be other families living in there. Okay? And so all of a sudden they'd say, okay, well, who's this? And they'd say, well, that's this one. Well, are they related? Well, maybe. You know, you had no clue if they were related or not. All you know is there was a name. And now here's the fascinating thing about this. If you ever looked at it, and if you ever got a copy of these censuses, they're awesome, okay? Because it's like, okay, here's the person's name, and how old are they? They would get their age, and they would say, okay, what's your age? Now you got to remember, most people back then were not born in hospitals.
Right.
They were born at home, okay? And sometimes the only way to calculate how old they were was based upon when they started school, or somebody that was around when they were born, because they didn't have no records down at the courthouse. Okay, so anyway, so you're doing this, and then they would have they would basically have their ethnic group. Okay, now the ethnic group was this: you were either white, black, or mulatto, and they would put an M for mulatto. Okay, that meant you were neither white nor black, and they had no clue what you were.
Mud puppy.
You could have been a Heinz 57. You know, you don't know. It could have been that, especially back then, especially in the eastern part of Kentucky, where my mom and dad are down right above Tennessee. You had the Cherokee Indians. Okay, and a lot of times, like my great grandmother was a full-blood Cherokee Indian. Okay, and so you can see it actually in my mom and a couple of my brothers, Chico, with the high cheekbone and everything, and you can see that. In my uncles, you can really see it. That was along on my mom's side. And anyway, I wasn't smart enough to realize that I could have gone to college and had my college paid for, because all you had to be was 1/8 Indian. Okay, and they would pay your college, and I wasn't smart enough, and my sister was, and so her son actually got all of his college paid for, and do that. But anyway, so I was telling my mom one day, I said, Mom, I don't know what we've got in our blood. She said, what do you mean? And I said, well, think about it. Back in the days, they basically took their occupation as their last name. And I said, so what's my last name? She said, well, Cotton.
I got it now. I get it now.
And I said, so anyway, so it's hard, and it really is. It's hard to figure out so many things. So anyway, when you look at this, and you see at verse number 38, it starts coming from God going forward, from God to Adam, Adam's son Seth, and to Enos and stuff. So here we go in verse number 36 of Luke chapter 3. There's a guy there by the name of son of Canaan, Cainan, and the son of Arphaxad, okay, who was the son of Shem, who was the son of Noah, son of Lamech, Methuselah, Enoch, Jared, Mahalalel, and another son of Canaan, okay? So when you begin to look at this and you say, okay, so this is a genealogy. Well, go back to Genesis chapter 11 and verse number 12. Let me get my stuff here again. Okay. So when you begin to start looking at this, and you get down to verse number 12, it said, Arpachshad lived 35 years, and he fathered Shelah. Okay. Now, when you go over into Luke chapter 36, you see Arphaxad, or Arphaxad there. It's the same name here that he has as Arpachshad, okay? And it said he fathered Shelah. Well, now, when you look at the end of 34, in the beginning, or 35, and you come here to Arphaxad, who do you see? Shelah, Canaan, and Arphaxad. But if you go back into the book of Genesis, you don't find that Canaan missing or in there. He's not in that genealogy. So some people are saying, okay, Luke messed up. Why did Luke put in this guy's name? Because that Moses didn't write his name in there when he was beginning to write. And so what ends up happening is that there were two other writers that wrote around this time, and I've talked to you about these guys. There's some fascinating stories, okay, and sometimes when you look at the Bible, who was the Bible basically written by? Yeah, but they were basically what? Jewish. Yeah. So they were basically Jewish. Well, there is a Samaritan version of this, and it's called the Targum, T-A-R, or Targum, T-A-R-G-U-M, that was also written around this time. And they're saying, well, hold on a minute. This was basically written from the Jewish perspective. They were the writers. They were the chosen people. Well, how does that affect us? And so they had their own. Also, back there in that period of time, there was a guy who wrote, not inspired by God, okay? He did not write it as the Bible, as God's spoken word. He wrote it as a historian. His name is Josephus, okay? Josephus lived a little bit right around the time of Christ. And what Josephus did was Josephus wrote a lot of the stuff from a historical perspective, okay? He didn't write it as a divine inspiration from God, okay? So when Josephus would see things, he would write it from this perspective. So what happens is that when you go into the Targum, which is a Samaritan aspect of God's Bible or God's Word, Josephus, which was giving us a historical version, neither one of those mentioned this guy that Luke mentions at all. And so, and this is where a lot of people say, okay, well then this must be a contradiction, because Josephus is writing it from a historical, and he doesn't have him in there. The Samaritans, or the Targum, which is written from the Samaritans' perspective, they didn't have him in there. So what makes the Jewish aspect of this correct? And you're going to get people that's going to start messing with you and trying to make you not believe that the Word of God is correct, because they'll say, "Hey, if I can find one contradiction, then what makes you think that there's not more?" And so what they do is they begin to do this, okay? And so what happened is a lot of times that you'll see, again, remembering that the King James Version of the Bible was translated from the Latin Vulgate, okay, which is what the Catholics' Bible is from, because they had the manuscripts that they had found and captured in 300 AD, okay? I think it's 360 AD, okay? And so what happened was that when you begin to see this, you'll begin to see there's a thing called the if I can pronounce this word, it's a Septuagint, okay? It's easy for you all to say, okay? But what you see in here is that you see this in the present day copies of these, and not in some of the older copies that were there. So it doesn't mean that they're not good. It just means that what's happened now is that we're seeing more and more of the original manuscripts, okay, that were there. And so when you begin to see these things, you begin to see a lot of the things and how they begin to connect. And so what you see here is that there probably was not this guy by the name of Canaan, okay? But that doesn't mean that Luke put it in there, okay? And this is sometimes where we run into some issues that are there, because my question to you is, which is better? And okay, and when I was copying, I would count how many letters there were. So if you're sitting there and you're copying all of these letters, do you think that maybe somebody might have missed one? Because all they do is they count the letters from on the line. I've got 100, or well, let's say I've got 55 letters or 60 letters on the line. And they're sitting there copying. And I don't know about y'all, but if that is my job, is to sit there and copy this stuff day after day after day, and I'm doing this, you got to remember they didn't have electricity. They're doing this by candle wax.
The flickers.
Oh yeah. And most of the time, you know, you might even be doing this at night. And so what ends up happening was, what you end up seeing is this is the way it is. But you see this extra that's sitting between those two lines? And this is where this came from, the Canaan. Okay? Now, the Septuagint, you have to understand, the Septuagint was translated by 72 rabbis. Not one person.
Yeah.
Okay? So this is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The five books of the law, or the 5 books of Moses. Okay? You had 72 rabbis sitting there and translating this. And it's not hard for someone to get it wrong. Doesn't mean that the Bible was wrong. Okay? And what happens is, when you look at the newer manuscripts, you'll find, and they've found it, and this is, this is where they found some things today. And you'll see it in some of the newer translations of Bible, okay? You will see them say, we've included, there's a couple of verses in Mark, I believe it is. I believe there's a whole chapter in John that they actually did not find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls predate the Latin Vulgate scripts, okay? And so there's a lot of argument going on right now as to, hold on, which is better, the older ones or these? And these are the ones we've had for so many years, you know, for what, 300 AD?
Aren't there some, I don't mean to change the subject, but it reminded me, aren't there some books that the Catholic Church claims that
Yep.
teaches on that
Right.
most of our Bibles don't have?
Yep. Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there was 400 years between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew. Okay? In our Bible that we read, okay, what happens is, we do not include the book of Maccabees and the second book of Esther, I think, is one of theirs. And there's about 11 or 12 of them, if I remember right, maybe 13 books. The reason they're not included here in this is there were general rules as to if you would include a book or not include a book. Okay? And the way it would be was, okay, if I found 80 manuscripts, because you got to remember, it's not just one manuscript. They would find multiple manuscripts. And they would say, okay, what is consistent with all 80 of these manuscripts? Okay. Oh, cool. I made my 10,000 steps today. I got a flag for first place. So anyway, what would happen is they would say, well, we don't find these books in all of these manuscripts. We find them in only a couple. And because we only find them in a couple, we're not going to include them in there. And so what ended up happening was, again, the Catholic Church said, oh, well, we found these, so we're including them. The book of Maccabees actually is about the Maccabean War that happened during that 400-year period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, there was a war that was going on, and things that was happening, and so those are the books that you'll find. Okay, and I can give you, I can get a list of names of all of them, because I actually have a book in there. It's called the Lost Book of the Bibles. Lost Book of the Bible. Books of the Bible, yeah, is the name of it. And it has all of those that the Catholic Bible includes. Okay? Which we don't, because of the process that it goes through as to why it's included into the Bible, why it's not included. And they don't meet the criteria to be included. That's why we don't have them. Okay? So anyway, so that ends up getting there. So what you end up seeing is that the early copies of the Septuagint do not have it in there. But the later translations of Luke do have this name. And this is where it ends up rubbing sometimes. And this is why you're going to find people that are going to say, hold on a minute, why aren't they the same? Well, if you were to take an orange that was grown on a tree in 1960 and look at an orange that was grown on a tree today from the year 2000, do you think they're the same? What's different about them?
Have different things blended in them.
Yeah, we've started experimenting, right?
Make it better.
Yeah, I'm going to make it taste better. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it so that it's insect resistant. So I'm doing all kinds of things to it, to make sure that it's a little bit. And so sometimes this is what ends up happening in some of the manuscripts that were there. They tried their best, and you got to understand, it's not God translating it. It's a human that's translating it. And sometimes it's like I'm telling you a story, right? Did you play the old game Post Office? Or telephone, where you would sit there and you'd tell somebody something, and then you'd have like 10 or 15 people in a circle, and they would tell the next person, and then all of a sudden the last person would get it back to you, and it was nothing like anything that you started out with. And why? Because somebody added and added and added. They tried their best not to do this, but you got to understand, when you've got 72 rabbis doing this day in and day out by a flicker of a candlelight, it is very easy to mix up some of those letters, because they're counting the letters. Okay? And so which one's the right manuscript? That's why I say to you, that's why I say that the earlier the manuscripts, you begin to see, the things that are happening in there. The closer I can get to the original Word of God, the better off I'm going to be. Agree? And that's why a lot of the newer translations are going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's why you're seeing differences. It's not contradictions, okay? It's a process over a period of time. Let me give you one more, and I'll finish, okay? This one has to do with the 3 days and 3 nights, because there's a whole bunch of discussion about, remember when the Bible says that just as Jonah was going to in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, that Jesus was going to be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And there's 2 different discussions, because when did the women come and find out that Jesus was not there? Yeah, it was the morning after the Sabbath. So it was the first day of the week. Okay? And this is why we celebrate and have our church services on Sunday rather than like the Jewish and some of the other ones, Seventh-day Adventists and others that have their services on Saturday. Because they revert back to saying, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And so what they say is the Sabbath is Saturday, the seventh day of the week, and so therefore you should be doing church on Saturday. Christians, okay, we celebrated on Sunday because it was the first day of the week when they came to see and Jesus had risen. So we celebrate his resurrection. They celebrate the law on the Sabbath, okay? So when you begin to read some of this, here's the discussion. What is Good Friday? Why do we have Good Friday? What's so significant about Good Friday?
When they buried him?
Yeah, that's when he was crucified. Crucified and buried. And when did he arise? On Sunday, right? So how do you get 3 days? So how do you get 3 days between Friday and Sunday?
Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
They came there Sunday morning and he was already gone. So there are some that will basically say that Jesus actually was crucified on Wednesday, because there were a couple of Sabbath days that were holy days that actually fell on Thursday, not necessarily Saturday. And you think about this for a minute. And again, why did they have to get him off the cross and into the grave? You'll see it in the Bible. The Bible says because the Sabbath was coming, and they had to get him off of the cross before the Sabbath started, and the Sabbath started at 6 o'clock at night at sundown. Okay, so they had to get Jesus off the cross before 6. Otherwise, they would have to wait, and he would be hanging there until after the Sabbath was over. Okay. And they weren't going to do that, because you got to understand, it's gross, but a lot of times when they crucified the people, they left them on the cross and the birds would come and eat. The vultures would, and a lot of times what they would do is after they're all picked apart, they would just take the bones and they would just go into a mass grave, okay? But I've got this person here that tries to explain it, okay? And so what they had was that Friday actually started at sundown Thursday, okay? And so that's when they crucified him. Was during that time. So they're saying day one was Friday. And then Friday ends at sundown. So they're saying that Friday starts at sundown on Thursday. So if Jesus died on the cross on Thursday before 6 o'clock, then that counts as one night. Okay? So you follow me? So that counts as one night. Then Friday ends at sundown. So on the next morning, that would have been one day. So now we're at one day and one night. Now, Saturday would start at sundown on Friday. And so sundown, that would be 2 nights. Okay? Now, then, and this is where it gets there. So Saturday ends at sundown, okay? So then now you have the third day, or the second day, I'm sorry. Now Sunday starts, they're talking about the night, the third night would start at sundown on Saturday night. Okay? And then at 6 o'clock in the morning, Sunday would start, and that would be the day. Because they're not, what they're saying is that even if it was, they ran because they didn't get up until sundown. They couldn't. Okay? They had to wait for the Sabbath to end. And the end of the Sabbath would not end until 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. And so therefore, it would take them a little bit of time to get from where they were at to the grave of Jesus, because they couldn't start until sundown. And so if Jesus was in the grave only for 30 seconds after sundown and he arose, then they're saying that that's would count as a day. And so this is how they come up with saying that Jesus was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights based upon Good Friday. And this is how they calculate that, okay? So sometimes when some people say, well, it can't happen that way, okay, it can if you put certain parameters in there. It didn't say that it had to be a complete 12 hours. Okay? It just had to end at a certain time frame after the 12th hour period to be included as a day or a night. And that's how they came up with Good Friday, coming on Friday, ending on Sunday morning when they got there, and including that Saturday was the Sabbath, okay? And so sometimes, and here's why I tell you this, okay? Because you're going to get some fanatic that's going to tell you, why are you celebrating Good Friday? Because there is no way that Jesus could have been in the grave 3 days and 3 nights off the grave, off the cross on Friday, or put on the cross on Friday and rise on Sunday morning. Well, yeah, you can, if what you're saying is part of this, and again, coming to Friday sometime during the day, that includes the day. Friday night to Saturday morning or that's the night, the next day. Then you got the night, day, night, and then day, 6 o'clock. And so it's not a contradiction, okay? Because the Bible doesn't stipulate that it had to be a 12-hour period of time. It could have been any period of time, okay, to be counted as a day. And so it allows you to explain to the fanatic that no, you don't have to have the Sabbath during the week, even though they did have 2. Okay.
Hello, this is Pastor Chuck Cotton from Calvary Baptist Church. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for taking the time out to either listen to our sermon or to watch it on video. We are grateful that you've actually taken the time, and hope and pray that it has been a blessing to you as it was to us as we delivered it to our congregation. We ask if you have any questions whatsoever that you email us at pastorchuck@calvarybaptistmiddletown.org, or you could come in and give us a phone call, if you would please, at area code 513-423-7251. I'd like to take this opportunity to also invite you to come to our church and visit us, if you would please. We actually have small groups on Sunday morning starting at 9:30, with our morning worship following at 10:45. Prior to our morning small groups, we also provide donuts with coffee, milk, orange juice, a time for fellowship, get to know each other, have a good time before we actually break out into our small groups for Sunday. Our worship services are uplifting, they're fast moving, and everything in our service is just a fast pace. But we do take time every once in a while to slow down as we feel the Holy Spirit moving, and we never want to hinder it in any way. We also have on Sunday evening and during the school year, we have Awana, and Awana starts with the Puggles, actually from age 2 all the way up through high school. And during that period of time, we also have a worship service. Both of these start at 6 o'clock and end at 7:30. Our Wednesday night, we have a Bible study, which starts at 7. We generally finish about 8:15. We would love for you to come and visit with us. Don't have to dress up. Just come as you are, because to us, it doesn't matter. You're a child of God, a creation of His, and so to us, you're important to everything that we do. Our motto here is building the kingdom one life at a time, and we hope that we have a chance to visit with you, get to know you as you get to know us. So thank you, and may God bless you.